Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we are continuing our series on the Iraq War, and we're talking about probably the one bright spot in what elsewhere has been a very negative, very dark spot on American foreign policy, and that is the 2007 through 2009 surge that was put in place by President Bush, General Petraeus. Let's get into it. Alright guys, so I'm picking up from our last episode. If you will recall, Iraq has been plunged into deep sectarian warfare, sectarian civil war of Sunni against Shia, of Sunni against American forces, Shia against American forces, and into 2005, 2006, this warfare, this violence escalates to a level that the American government has to realize that their policy in Iraq, the Iraq project in general, is in danger of completely falling apart. So what ends up happening is President Bush and his cabinet undertake a review of the Iraq War, of the policies, of what we should be doing, of our strategy, most importantly, in Iraq. They come to the conclusion that they need a fundamental changing of their strategy. So what the U.S. government ends up doing is, instead of trying to just focus on counterterrorism and building up the Iraqi security services, they switch their mindset from counterterrorism to counterinsurgency. Because at this point, the main problem isn't terrorism, the main problem is the insurgency that is broiling in Iraq that's causing all this sectarian tension. So what they do is, Donald Rumsfeld thankfully steps down as defense secretary. They promote Robert Gates. General David Petraeus is put in charge of all the forces in Iraq, and he had a lot of success up in Mosul in Iraq as the leader of the 101st Airborne Division. So he's put in place to oversee the effort in Iraq from the armed forces perspective, and Ambassador Ryan Crocker is put in as sort of the head of the State Department, head of the diplomatic effort. And this team between Robert Gates, General Petraeus, and Ryan Crocker create this sort of new counterinsurgency strategy. And so what does counterinsurgency actually mean? What does it look like? Well, basically the biggest thing is you have to have more forces in the country. Why do you have to have more forces? Because counterinsurgency, the number one priority, is protecting and providing security for the local population. The biggest reason why insurgency was happening in Iraq was because the U.S. government, the U.S. forces could not actually provide adequate security in Iraq for the political system that they were trying to put in place, i.e. democracy, to actually take root. If you don't have security, democracy is going to take a backseat to protecting your own. And so what happened is Sunni tribesmen would turn to the Sunni insurgency led by Al-Qaeda forces. Shia populations would turn to the Shia militias, mostly back from Iran, to protect them, and then you had civil war. But if the U.S. forces can provide security through a surge of forces, and through, instead of trying to look for terrorists and bang down doors and gather up people that they may or might not be terrorists, instead of doing that, focusing on providing security and rooting out the insurgents and the militias, then that provides security and democracy can take root. Now, it's worth taking a step back here. This channel has been extremely critical of the Bush administration, and we think rightly so. The decision to invade Iraq, the initial handling of the war in Iraq were pretty much as atrocious as you could possibly get. But we have to take notice, we have to give credit to President Bush in particular, because he made a very difficult decision where at a point when American forces were going to be drawing down, they were actually going to draw down, take a lot of forces out of Iraq. President Bush not only stops that, but he increases the forces. And this is when America is right in the middle of being war weary. They don't understand the war. They're getting frustrated. They want their forces to come home. And Bush makes a very hard decision to say, no, not only are we not bringing them home, we're going to increase the force load in Iraq so that we can take control of the situation. And that deserves a lot of credit for President Bush. It doesn't negate all the negative things that he did, but at least he gets credit for making this very hard political decision. And so the troop surge happens in Iraq, the diplomatic surge happens in Iraq, and General Petraeus talks about the surge being primarily a surge of ideas, a surge of how to engage the Iraqi population. And the linchpin of this strategy was actually the U.S.'s ability to co-opt the Sunni tribesmen in the north and in the west of Iraq. Think around Fallujah, think around up north in Mosul. Because as you know from previous episodes, these Sunni tribesmen have turned to the insurgency to provide protection and honor to their populations. But at this point, many of the Sunni tribes had become, shall we say, tired with the medieval rule of Al-Qaeda, which means you can't gamble, you can't drink, you have to be you have to give into a very fundamentalist position of Islam, and they ruled with violence and fierce oppression. The U.S. was able to take advantage of this. They went into these different areas, met with Sunni tribal leaders, and what resulted was what was called the Sunni Tribal Awakening, where all these Sunni tribesmen switched from the insurgency and actually started working with the American forces, and they started to root out the al-Qaeda forces, the insurgent forces in these Sunni areas. Now this was crucial to fighting the insurgency because as this started to happen, the al-Qaeda forces, the insurgent forces started to shrink. They lost a lot of their legitimacy in the eyes of the Sunni population because the Sunni tribesmen were pushing them out, and crucially, the American forces were coming in and providing security. There wasn't a security vacuum for the insurgents to come back and exploit. And so this happened all over the country, in Sunni areas, in Shia areas, and basically it was a success. It was a huge success. The surge worked, the counterinsurgency strategy worked. But crucially, and we're going to talk about this next episode, all this counterinsurgency strategy ever was supposed to be was to give the Iraqi government, the domestic Iraqi government, time to get its political house in order. So the counterinsurgency worked insofar as it provided security and the necessary conditions for the Iraqi government to go forth with its democracy and its governance of Iraq. The problem is the Iraqi government, once the counterinsurgency happened, did not necessarily rule Iraq the way it should have. It didn't take advantage of the unifying effect of the counterinsurgency. In fact, it alienated many of these populations. But we'll talk about these wonderful things next week. This week, I want us to be positive. I want it to be positive today, guys, because we haven't had a lot of positivity surrounding the Iraq War. But just remember, if you want to take something positive away from the Iraq War, the counterinsurgency, the surge strategy that was put in place by President Bush, General Petraeus, Ambassador Ryan Crocker, it did work for a time. Crucially, however, counterinsurgency is only ever a limited solution because all it can do is provide security. The onus, the burden of responsibility then falls on the domestic political government to provide adequate governing solutions to the civil war, to the sectarian tensions in whatever region you are. So again, counterinsurgency is great, it worked, but it was only ever a limited option to afford the Iraqi government the time to get their house in order. Alright guys, that's it. Thanks for watching the channel. Share the videos, subscribe to the channel, guys. We really appreciate your input. Comment below, comment on our Facebook page, and remember, reality always trumps ideology.